Welcome back, everyone. This is Angel Miller with People of Shambhala. Many of you will know by now that one of the major focuses of People of Shambhala is on the idea of the higher man, and this can be in regard to the body. How do we improve the physical condition? It can certainly be in regard to spirituality, which is probably the major focus, and other things as well, from dress through to business, which is a huge part of the modern world today. Whether one is personally involved in business or not, doesn't really matter. It affects all of our lives. And today we're going to be speaking to Ram Nidumolu, author of Two Birds in a Tree, Timeless Indian Wisdom for Business Leaders. And I think it's a pretty fascinating conversation, and Ram Nidumolu has a very different take on the way the business should be done in the modern world, and he bases his philosophy, which he describes through his book, on Hindu philosophy from the Rig Veda to the Upanishads. I think it's a unique and very insightful perspective, and I think regardless of whether you're in business or consider yourself to be a leader in some other way, a public figure in some other way, maybe you're a musician or a blogger or something like that, I think you'll get a lot out of it. Ram Nidumolu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And you're the author of Two Birds in a Tree, Timeless Indian Wisdom for Business Leaders, which is a pretty radical way of looking at business in the modern world, and based in a more spiritual, more ethical way of doing things, and more specifically based in Indian philosophy. But perhaps before we go into that, you could just give us a little bit about your background and where you came from, and your background in business, and how you came to write the book.
Sure. Yeah. So I was born in India, and I spent my childhood, like many other Indian kids, I guess, middle-class Indian kids, really focused on education, and I ended up doing an engineering degree and then an MBA out of India. And all that while, my concern was about essentially moving ahead in life, a good career, doing well in business. And then I came to the U.S. for a PhD in management, and then got into academia as a business school professor. And throughout all these years, it sort of had this kind of a split personality. One side of me was all about business and making business more competitive and improving business and so on. And the other side developed this interest in Indian philosophy, in particular Vedanta.
Ah, really? Okay. Yeah, and it's interesting you should say split personality, because I don't think you're alone there. I think a lot of people may feel that in this day and age, where there's some kind of pull towards spirituality to different degrees, but also there's a very sort of materialistic lifestyle that is presented to us, particularly in the West, but probably not exclusively in the West at all. But you're one of you're the founder of and CEO of InnovaStrat, and you're also a scholar at Stanford University's Kozometsky Global Collaboratory. Perhaps you could just
an affiliated scholar.
Okay, and what does that do exactly, or what was your role in that?
So as an affiliated scholar, I help. That role has reduced somewhat in the past 6 months, because I was working at another organization. But last year, when I was around the time of the publication of the book, that role included working with the center, which is trying to develop this concept of shareable prosperity. And that is prosperity that's created from the very beginning, as opposed to, you start a company, you do well, and then you give some money away in charity.
Right.
Instead of disposing of prosperity at the end, sharing in the prosperity at the end. The goal of the center is how do you create shareable prosperity from the very beginning.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting. And what kind of form would that take?
It would be creating projects that require working with, for example, the disadvantaged in society in India and elsewhere. Developmental projects, but bringing in modern management practices, science, and some of the resources that Stanford has, for example.
Oh, great.
With creating these kinds of economic and developmental outcomes that also address not just the economic well-being, but also the whole well-being, including the spiritual well-being of people.
Right, and we're definitely going to get onto that. But what led you to write Two Birds in a Tree?
So as I was saying, I had this kind of a split, I guess, concerns
Yeah.
One was about business in general, and that was all about innovation. And that moved progressively to being concerned about sustainability, the future of business and the future of society and nature. And so that's the sustainable business side of it. And as I did more and more of that, I realized that for true change to take place in business, there needs to be a change at the internal level.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just these external models that don't really have depth and have traction.
Yeah.
So that internal change is critical, and that then drew upon the other side of what I've been thinking about for about 20 years now. And that's the internal spiritual, or the mindset that's at the core level, the sense of who we are, the sense of our higher self. And the book became an attempt to sort of fuse the two together.
Right, right. Yeah, well, I really enjoyed it, and I found it to be a very different approach to business indeed, and certainly a much healthier one. And, we have seen in the last few years, whether one agrees with them or not, but, have these movements like Occupy Wall Street on the left, and then the Tea Party on the right. Whatever one may think of them, whether we like them or we don't, it doesn't really matter. But I think that it sort of indicates that there's a big shift in society when it comes to business and the way we do things. And,
that's right.
And I think that your book maybe addresses a lot of the issues in a way that's a lot healthier. And being centered leadership is a big factor in your philosophy. So perhaps you could just explain what that is a little bit.
Yeah, so I see this notion of being is probably the oldest notion in the world, at least in terms of philosophy. And I see that as something that's very rich for business and for what we're seeing now in terms of future capitalism.
Yeah.
And at the core of it is the sense that we're all interconnected, these hidden connections between us and other human beings as well as other beings. So I see that as a way to address not just inequality in society, but also the destruction of nature. Because and I think that quote in the Isha Upanishad, I think, sums it up, that he who sees himself in all beings and all beings in his own self loses all fear and embraces the world. I think it's that which being centered leadership is about, to seeing our interconnection with the world around us. And that interconnection is sensed at a very deep level, in the sense, and that interconnection is where the higher self is. Then your actions become more ethical, they become more responsible, quite naturally, as opposed to external responsibilities.
Right, right. And I think, the way you think about things is a lot more helpful. I mean, when we usually think about complaining about something like deforestation, it tends to be sort of almost an anti-business sort of ethic behind it. Whereas you feel that business, which is always run by people after all, can actually be good for the environment and be a positive influence in the world, not just a sort of money making at all costs kind of machine.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, business has, over the last 2 centuries, perfected this ability to, one, be efficient, to bring down costs, and to be creative, innovation. And those capabilities can then be brought to bear, as opposed to setting business aside and being anti-business. The challenge there is, how do you make this an intrinsic part of business, as opposed to just an external responsibility? How do you make this an intrinsic part of the way business leaders think and behave and act? Yeah. And that's what drew me to being centered leadership. And just one other clarification. Being centered leadership is not just for people who are spiritual. The notion of being doesn't necessarily have to be only spiritual. Yeah. It can also be for atheists and agnostics and so on. Right. So at some level, the word being, or the concept of being, might be more comforting to them than God, than the concept of God.
Yeah. And have you had positive feedback from business leaders, or?
Oh, very much so. There's just been excellent feedback. The challenge, I think, is as always, change is difficult because people are under this pressure, this short-term pressure to produce, to grow, and to have revenues very quickly. So it is not easy. It's positive, but not easy. Right. Right. It needs a lot more people thinking this way, talking this way, a lot more practices. Leadership practices being developed. I think I see that as the next frontier for this.
And you do mention in in Two Birds in a Tree, you give a few examples of different leaders that you feel sort of embody this ethic in different ways, or at least at different times. And it seems that when business leaders put this more being-centered leadership into practice, that it actually is very helpful to the company as well as the wider society and environment. But perhaps you could just give some examples about how you see this playing out.
In terms of companies?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so what I see is the book gives examples of about 21 CEOs and several companies going all the way back to the Body Shop, Puma under Johan Zeit's leadership, Unilever under Paul Polman's leadership, Wipro under Azim Premji's leadership, and just several companies like that. Alan Fisher's another one. And of course, Patagonia and the ones that are sustainable. But what I see is, there's this movement towards more ethical business, whether you call it conscious capitalism. There's a lot of work on conscious capitalism going on now.
Okay.
And there's also this Wisdom 2.0 in Silicon Valley. And so there are all these trends at some level, important trends. The sharing economy is another one, where you share goods. I think underneath that there needs to be a leadership approach. And I see being-centered leadership as a sort of engine of these trends. That sort of the internal leadership mindsets that lead to conscious capitalism, that lead to these other more responsible, sustainable capitalism and so on. So that's what I see playing out. Whether you call it being-centered leadership or not, I think there is a real realization that business leaders and business in general need to think of something beyond just profits. The question then is, what is it? What is that thing beyond that's comforting? And I think linking it to ancient wisdom suggests that this has been tried and tested over the past 3,000, 4,000 years and still has stayed with us, which means it has some real value.
Yes. Right, exactly. Yeah. And it does seem that with some business leaders, hopefully more and more in the past, that there's a kind of disconnect with them that they can be very nice people and perhaps very generous to the people they know and like, but can have very appalling sort of ethics when it comes to business and the people that work for them or the people they do business with, or the way they get their supplies and this sort of thing.
Yeah, and Andrew, I think that's exactly the core problem. In fact, the book starts off with that we set aside our notion of a whole person, a good person, when we walk in through the corporate door. And we sort of see business as being separated from these concerns that we have as human beings.
Yes.
And we see it as a separate thing, that it's okay in business not to have the concerns of a human being, that it can be for just money and profit, and it's that thinking that this book is trying to break. That you have to bring your whole being into business. Yeah. Because ultimately business is an integral part of what we do. So you can't separate it out and say that its impacts are to be discounted because it's business after all.
Right, exactly. And it sort of strikes me that business is the one area where this sort of disconnect has been allowed to happen. I mean, traditionally, maybe not today with so many different arts, but traditionally the different arts, or whether it was painting or whether it was being a warrior or something. In the past, there was always this sort of ethical center, and even up until, I guess, the early modern era, where you had, maybe beyond that as well, where you had trade guilds which had very definite ethical standards that you were supposed to adhere to. But
that's right. And I think, and that's what's missing in that sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that is at some level, the problem with capitalism as currently defined. Not making those ethical standards an integral part of how you evaluate success.
Yes. Yeah.
I think one solution to that the book advances and sort of working, that I see that as the next stage of where this can go. And that's to really define more clearly the notion of being capital. Because in the end, capitalism is about capital, whether it's financial capital, material capital, social capital, and so on. Or natural capital, which has become important now. Yeah. And I think what I see is undergirding all this, the sort of the foundation for these different kinds of capital is being capital. Right. And that's to do with integrity, it's to do with care, it's to do with authenticity, it's to do with connection. So all those qualities that being represents. to be able to assess that and to measure and to make it more important to consider being capital.
Right. So with the different kinds of capital, if you have natural capital, then you have resources to draw upon, and financial capital, you have finances to run your business.
Money to draw upon.
Right. But the one capital that we seem to have let slide is obviously the being capital.
Yeah. We don't value it.
No.
We don't. Whereas that's in a way the guide to the other kinds of capital.
Right.
So
it's
that's
the foundation.
What I see as the foundation.
Yeah.
If you have strong being capital, then your natural capital will stay healthy. Your material capital will not overwhelm the other kinds of capital.
Yeah. So and so obviously you feel that the less being capital you have, the worse kind of ethics you have. Then in the long run, maybe there will be short-term gains, but in the long run, you're actually going to damage your company.
Yeah, and the being capital can be directly related to the two birds in a tree.
Right.
So the less being capital you have, the less of this connection to the higher bird you have.
Right.
Which means the lower bird, which is all about material and gain and so on, becomes dominant at the cost of natural capital, at the cost of human capital, at the cost of social capital.
And perhaps you could just explain the origins of the two birds in a tree.
Yeah, so that's the symbol that's used throughout the book, and it first appeared in the Rig Veda about 1500 BC.
Right.
And then the story of two birds in a tree representing the higher self and the lower self. But it really got developed in the Upanishads, in particular two of these Upanishads, around 600, 700 BC. And so the passage in the Upanishads talks about this tree is the tree of life, or the tree of desire. The lower bird is our ego, the lower self in us, the ego-driven human self. And it's an anxious self, anxious about the future, regretful about the past, distracted from the present, constantly looking for fruit, dissatisfied with it, moving on. Very representative of business in a way, and how we behave in general. This sense of nothing is ever enough.
Right.
Then the Upanishads talk of this higher bird, which watches with compassion this lower bird, and is aware of the bigger picture of the whole, and recognizes that this kind of behavior is destructive in the long term. And the Upanishads also talk about how occasionally when the lower bird catches sight of the higher bird, connects to it, then its fears and its delusions and its greed and these other problems reduce. And so maintaining that connection is the challenge, so that you're guided by the higher bird. And that's the kind of the metaphor that I've taken for the book.
Yeah.
The chapters in the book describe the journey from the lower bird, which is the ego self, to the higher bird, which is the inclusive self.
Yeah. And one of the more unusual elements of your book is you talk about rituals, and you also talk about your father's funeral in there, and how that affected you.
Yeah.
And how do you see rituals and this kind of this element where it's repeated through generations? How do you see that related to? And
I wanted to write a book that was not just this impersonal, dry, out there kind of book.
Yeah.
I'm also part of this. I'm shaped by this journey. I'm also in business.
Yeah.
So that's why I wrote that. But there's another reason I did this, and this is, these rituals in ancient societies created symbolic value for us. They gave us a sense of the higher meaning of the work that we were doing.
Right.
And work is karma. So it gave you a higher sense of why this work is important, and they served as a guide for us. And that's missing in business. The sense of rituals that inform us of our higher purpose and guide us. And that's why I wrote that chapter, to say that we need those rituals, and these rituals clearly will be modern rituals.
Yeah.
But we need something by way of guiding businesses towards a higher purpose beyond just a low bird purpose of maximizing profits and shareholder earnings. And so that was that connection. Rituals are missing. Myths are missing. That kind of legacy, leaving legacy, is missing in business.
Yeah, that's right. And is that a problem including outside of business as well, do you think? Or it's more in business?
Well, so many of the lessons of being friendly leadership clearly apply to other areas. Yeah. Governance, for example, government. Right. That's. But I wrote this book initially in business because my experience has been that. And I would say in terms of the challenges we are facing, if business were to become a force of good, they can be the most powerful force, more powerful than any other institution.
Yeah.
But the lessons clearly apply to the education sector, the non-profit sector, government especially, and so on.
Yeah, and I think also as well, with the explosion of the internet and everybody putting their opinions on the net and other things as well, I think it can apply to almost anyone today, because we're all becoming more and more public and having influence on other people with our opinions. And
that's right. That's right. And if we're grounded in the higher self, grounded in being, then we become a force for the good of the whole.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's the sense of being authentic in the real sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And do you see Indian wisdom, Hindu philosophy, or maybe other philosophies as well, but non-Western philosophy or ancient philosophy, being more of an influence on business and maybe even the West in the future, more generally?
Yes, I do. I mean, not just necessarily Indian philosophy, but I do see that happening. I think as at some level, we all deeply understand that things are not going well. That there is something missing in this world, whether we believe in climate change or not. There is this kind of a disquiet. That's why I call it the neo-axial age. That we're facing the kind of dissatisfaction and concern and anxiety that societies faced 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And I think that's in response to that high sense of anxiety about the future. That's why there's interest in these ancient wisdom, but it needs to be made more contemporary. It needs to be applied in a new sense, informed by all that we know about from science and psychology and modern management science. It can't just be taken as is. It needs to be modified.
Right.
So yes, I do think there's a real future for this. It's already happening.
Yeah.
Whether it's conscious capitalism or there's wisdom 2.0. All these movements that are concerned about this, it's already happening.
Yeah, that's very optimistic. That's a very good thing. But I do notice that obviously some business leaders are really quite interested in ancient philosophy. I mean, there's a sort of New Age store in Manhattan where they have sort of meditation for leaders, and there's sort of courses going on, which is seems to be ultimately quite a positive thing. I mean, obviously there's the danger that people might just use it, kind of feel that it's all an illusion and they can do whatever they want. But I think if you can connect people to higher values that have been around for thousands of years, then that's a very different approach and a much better one. And it's really essential. Right.
As opposed to pop business, pop new business.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's really why I wanted to bring in this conceptual, theoretical base. That's been around for 2,500 years. Right,
absolutely. I mean, I really liked it because I feel it's a very healthy approach to business, and we do need to, whatever we do, really try and live ourselves as the higher self as much as possible, no matter what we do, and that obviously includes business leaders as well. So it's fantastic.
And I think it's a good point. Even though the book had examples of CEOs, really, everyone can be a business leader.
Right.
It's not just CEOs. And I think the other thing is, even if you go by the traditional metrics of profit and performance, the great irony here is, and the book gives a number of examples, is by following such an approach, you also do well. It's not that you're sacrificing your financial performance.
Right.
You do well. In addition, you meet the needs of other stakeholders. So it is good financially in the long term, too.
Yeah. If people want to find out more about the book and more about you and your work, what should they do? What is your website?
The best place to go to is the website of the same name, Two Birds in a Tree.
Okay.
And so we have information on the book, and then I've been blogging and writing articles on this, and
great.
I've also been published in the Harvard Business Review in different aspects of this.
Oh, great.
So there's a number of, there's an article that just came out last week, not on being-centered leadership, but on collaboration, the importance of collaboration.
Oh, great.
Which is one of the key themes of being-centered leadership.
Yeah.
And next week I'll actually be giving a keynote address at a Sustainability Summit in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, on how my own thinking has evolved towards being-centered leadership.
Oh, excellent.
I would sort of move that. And so a lot of that will be on Two Birds in a Tree, on that same website.
Great. And people can obviously order the book through Amazon.com or .co.uk or any of those. And
our Twitter handle is Two Birds Group.
Okay.
We also do a lot of tweeting, and we tweet a lot on Twitter. Two Birds Group is our handle.
Excellent. And is there anything else you'd like to say before we depart?
Not to worry about how many people will read this or will be moved by it, but just to bring this change in our individual life. That's enough.
Yes.
Not to think of outcomes, just think of internal process.
Yes.
The rest doesn't matter really. Not in my hands.
Yeah, well, even one person can make a difference. So.
Even one person.
Yeah.
And if you can make a difference to yourself and your family, that's great.
Yeah. Oh, great.
You don't have to conquer the world with this.
No, indeed. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's been great speaking to you, and thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Angel, and good luck to you on your own journey.
Thank
you.
You
seem to be on a good path.
Thank you.
Take care, Ram.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.